The portrait on the wall. In the spring of 2015, Emma Morris moved into a cottage on the outskirts of a small town in southern Vermont. The cottage was secluded, surrounded by dense woods, with only a few neighbors spread out over miles. Emma found solace in the quiet, even though the isolation made her feel uneasy at times. The rent was inexpensive for such a large home, which was both a blessing and a concern. The landlord, a wiry old man with a weathered face named Mr. Cutter, was quick to show her around and even offered her a deal. She could stay as long as she wanted, as long as she didn't ask too many questions about the house's past. Emma, eager to escape her troubles, paid little attention to Mr. Cutter's cryptic tone. The house was exactly what she was looking for. 2 stories, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and an upstairs bedroom with a large window that overlooked a field. But there was one thing that stuck out to her: a large, ornate portrait hanging in the hallway. The portrait was unsettling, to say the least. It was an oil painting of a middle-aged man, dressed in a dark suit with a white shirt and a red tie. His face was stern, with cold, dark eyes that seemed to follow Emma wherever she went in the house. The frame was gold and intricate, clearly expensive, and it hung directly across from her bedroom door. At first, Emma thought nothing of it. She was used to quirky decorations in older homes, and the portrait was just part of the house's character. But as she spent more time in the house, something about it began to gnaw at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the painting was watching her, staring at her with a knowing, almost mocking look. She told herself it was just her imagination. After all, she'd been alone for weeks, with only the occasional visit from Mr. Cutter to check in. But the unease only grew. The first night Emma spent alone in the house was the beginning of everything. She had unpacked, made a simple dinner, and was about to settle in for bed when she noticed something. The portrait, once perfectly still, seemed off. The eyes, they were different. The cold, distant stare had softened, becoming more intense. Emma couldn't explain it, but she felt as though the man in the painting was now looking directly at her, following her every movement. Shaking her head, she dismissed the feeling as fatigue. She was tired, and after all, she was alone in a new place. The isolation was bound to play tricks on her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt as though something was wrong. She opened them, staring at the painting across from her. The eyes were still watching her, and the expression on the man's face seemed angrier, more intense. She tried to ignore it and turned over, pulling the covers tighter around her. At 2 a.m., she heard a creak, a faint sound, like something heavy shifting in the hallway. Emma's heart raced. She lay still, listening, but heard nothing else and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next few days were a blur. Emma unpacked the rest of her belongings and explored the surrounding area. The house felt quiet, comfortable even, but the portrait still disturbed her. She decided it was time to cover it up, maybe with a piece of fabric or a curtain. That's when things took a turn. She stood in front of the painting, determined to block it from her view, when she noticed something even stranger. The man's face wasn't the same. It was subtle, but unmistakable. His lips were turned downward into a frown, and his eyes, still dark, looked almost sad. But the real shock came when she noticed a faint dark stain on the lower part of the frame. It looked like blood, dried and crusted over. Emma's pulse quickened. She backed away from the painting, her mind racing. There was no way it had been there before. She had been staring at it for days, and the stain hadn't been there. Had someone, or something, moved it? Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room. She was alone. She'd heard no one come into the house, and there were no signs of forced entry. But the stain, it didn't make sense. That night, things escalated. Emma was alone, lying in bed with the door to her room cracked open. The house was completely still, save for the occasional wind that rattled the windows. But then she heard it. A whisper, low, barely audible, but unmistakable. Leave. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She bolted upright, her heart pounding, and looked toward the hallway. The door was open, and the painting was clearly visible. The man's expression had changed again. This time, he was smiling. A wide, twisted smile that made Emma's stomach churn. She grabbed her phone, intending to call Mr. Cutter or even the police, but the signal was gone. The phone was dead, despite being fully charged. Panicking, Emma turned on all the lights in the house, her mind racing. There was no one here, she thought. It was just her, the house, and whatever was in it. The whisper came again, louder this time, almost mocking her. Leave. The following morning, Emma went to the local library to search for information about the house. After some digging, she found a name, Gerald Morrow. He had been the previous owner of the house, and as it turned out, he was a prominent figure in the town's history. He'd been a wealthy landowner, but after his sudden and mysterious death in 1923, the house had sat vacant for years. Emma found a newspaper article detailing his death. The cause? A heart attack, apparently, though no one could explain why his body had been found in the hallway near the stairs. What caught her eye was the detail that his body had been found beneath a portrait, the same portrait that was now hanging in her hallway. The article mentioned that Morrow's family had insisted the house was cursed. Neighbors claimed that he had grown increasingly paranoid before his death, muttering about voices and things that weren't there. That night, Emma decided to confront the painting. She couldn't stand it anymore. The whispering, the unsettling presence, it all felt like it was spiraling out of control. She stood in front of it and reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, hard surface of the frame. As she touched it, a sharp pain shot through her hand. She pulled back, blood dripping from her fingers. The frame had cut her, as though it had been waiting. But then, as she stood there, something changed. The house grew silent. The air became thick, heavy. And then she heard the voice again, louder, more insistent. "Leave now, or you'll be like me." It wasn't the voice of the man in the painting. It was something darker, something older. In a panic, Emma grabbed her things and ran out of the house, the door slamming shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. Emma never returned to the cottage. She moved into a small apartment in the city, far from the countryside. To this day, she won't speak about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, when she's alone, she can still hear the voice from the painting, whispering in the back of her mind, calling her to come back. And every time she closes her eyes, she can still see that twisted smile staring at her from the depths of the portrait. The voice in the basement. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After losing her job and going through a rough divorce, Rachel wanted nothing more than to create a new life for herself and her two sons, Lucas 10 and Ethan 6. She found what seemed like the perfect opportunity, a charming affordable rental house in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb. The house was modest but cozy, with a fenced-in yard where the boys could play and a spacious basement for storage. It wasn't brand new, far from it, but Rachel figured it had character. "Every creak and groan just tells a story," she told the boys with a smile. Little did she know, the house would tell stories she'd never want to hear. The first oddity appeared on move-in day. While the main part of the basement was just as described, unfinished, with cement floors and old wooden shelves, there was one door at the far end that was padlocked shut. Rachel asked the landlord about it during the final walkthrough. "It's just an old root cellar," he said, waving it off. "Been locked up for years. Honestly, I don't even have the key anymore. Nothing important in there, just old junk. Best to leave it alone." Rachel didn't think much of it at the time. The boys, however, were fascinated. "What if there's treasure in there?" Ethan had asked excitedly. "Or a monster?" Lucas added with a grin. "Knock it off," Rachel said, laughing. "It's just a dusty old closet." For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. The boys settled into their new school, Rachel found a part-time job at a local cafe, and life felt normal. But soon, strange things began to happen. It started with noises. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Rachel would hear faint sounds coming from the basement, soft thuds like someone shifting heavy furniture. At first, she thought it might be the old furnace, but then the noises became more distinct. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a sound that made her freeze in place. It was a voice, a low, muffled whisper, coming from the basement. She couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human. Rachel told herself it was her imagination. She was tired, stressed. It couldn't be what it sounded like. The boys, naturally, had no fear of the basement. They loved to play down there, racing toy cars on the cement floor or pretending the shelves were part of a pirate ship. One afternoon, while Rachel was upstairs folding laundry, she heard Ethan screaming. She ran downstairs, her heart pounding, and found him sitting on the floor, clutching his knee. "What happened?" she asked, pulling him into her arms. "I tripped," he whimpered, pointing toward the locked door. "But I heard someone laughing. From in there." Rachel's stomach dropped. Lucas, standing nearby, shook his head. "It wasn't me," he said quickly. "I heard it too, Mom, like a creepy laugh." Rachel inspected Ethan's knee. It was just a small scrape, but the boys were visibly shaken. She told them to stay out of the basement from now on. "It's old and dangerous," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Play upstairs where it's safe." That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening intently, half hoping to hear nothing. But around 2 a.m., the familiar thuds began again. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. She held her breath, clutching the blanket, when suddenly the whispers returned. Only this time she could understand them. "Rachel," the voice hissed, soft but clear. "Rachel, come down." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe it was a dream, but the sound was too real, too specific. Gathering every ounce of courage, she grabbed her phone and crept to the basement door. She pressed her ear against it, her pulse pounding in her ears. Silence. The next day, Rachel called the landlord again. She told him about the noises, the voice, everything. He laughed nervously. "Look, it's an old house," he said. "You're probably just hearing the pipes or animals in the walls. There's nothing down there." "But what about the root cellar?" she pressed. "What's in there?" "I told you, nothing important," he replied curtly. "Just leave it alone." Unsatisfied, Rachel decided to take matters into her own hands. She drove to the hardware store and bought bolt cutters. That night, after putting the boys to bed, she descended the basement stairs, the air heavy and cold. Her hands trembled as she cut through the padlock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. It smelled of damp earth and decay. Inside were a few rusted tools, broken jars, and old wooden crates. But in the center of the room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A small, child-sized chair, its arms worn smooth, and a thick iron chain bolted to the floor beside it. Rachel stumbled back, her breath shallow. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her. The single bare bulb in the room flickered, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Stay with me," the voice rasped. She felt a cold hand graze her shoulder and screamed, yanking the door open and bolting upstairs. The boys found her sitting at the kitchen table, shaking and pale. She didn't tell them what she'd seen. Rachel decided they couldn't stay in the house any longer. She booked a motel and planned to leave the next morning. But that night, the house fought back. It began with the basement door swinging open on its own, slamming repeatedly against the wall. The boys screamed as the lights flickered, and the air filled with an oppressive, suffocating energy. Rachel grabbed the boys and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. From the basement, the voice roared now, guttural and enraged. "You can't leave! You're mine!" Rachel huddled with her sons in the corner of the living room, whispering prayers until the chaos abruptly stopped. The door unlocked itself. Without hesitation, they fled into the night. Rachel never went back. She hired a moving company to retrieve their belongings and refused to speak to the landlord again. Months later, she learned through a local historian that the house had a dark history. In the 1940s, a man had been arrested there for keeping children locked in the basement. Some escaped, others didn't. To this day, Rachel refuses to talk about what happened in the house. Lucas and Ethan, now grown, say they barely remember the details. But sometimes, late at night, Rachel still dreams of the root cellar and the voice that wanted her to stay. The shadow in the window. Have you ever experienced something so inexplicable, so unsettling, that you question everything you thought you knew about reality? This story is about someone who did, and it changed their life forever. It all started with a move to a small, picturesque town in upstate New York. Amanda, a 34-year-old graphic designer, had been looking for a fresh start after a messy breakup. When she found the perfect rental, a charming, two-story Victorian home with creaky wooden floors and bay windows, she thought she'd hit the jackpot. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the landlord seemed eager to lease the place. A little Too eager, perhaps. The house stood on the edge of the forest with no immediate neighbors. Amanda didn't mind. She liked her privacy. Besides, she thought, what could be more inspiring than working from home, surrounded by nature? But by the second night, Amanda started to notice odd things. It began with subtle sounds, nothing dramatic at first. The occasional creak of a floorboard, the faint hum of what sounded like a distant whistle. It's the house settling, she thought. An excuse she'd heard her parents use countless times in her childhood. But then came the knocks. It was around midnight, and Amanda was scrolling on her phone in bed when she heard it. 3 distinct knocks on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. She froze. Who could be at her door at this hour? The town was small and quiet, and she didn't know anyone there yet. Summoning her courage, she tiptoed downstairs, her heart pounding. She peeked through the peephole. No one was there. Amanda opened the door slightly, the hinges groaning in protest. The porch was empty, the street silent, bathed in pale moonlight. She stepped outside, the cool night air sending shivers all over, and scanned the area. Nothing. No footsteps on the gravel driveway, no movement in the shadows. It was probably some kids playing a prank, she told herself. Shaking off the unease, she locked the door and went back to bed. The next day passed uneventfully, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She worked at her desk, facing a large bay window overlooking the backyard. Every so often she'd glance up, feeling the hairs on her neck prickle. But the yard was empty, just a stretch of grass leading to the tree line. That night, as she was brushing her teeth, something in the bathroom mirror caught her eye. It was a reflection of the hallway window behind her. For a brief second, she thought she saw movement, a shadow, fleeting and unnatural. She turned around, but the window was empty. Still, her heart raced. She closed the blinds and told herself she was imagining things. Moving to a new place, especially one as isolated as this, was bound to play tricks on her mind. Over the next week, the knocks became more frequent, always 3, always at midnight. Amanda stopped answering the door, and then the whispers started. She'd be lying in bed, trying to ignore the knocking, when she'd hear faint murmurs. At first, she thought it was her imagination or the wind. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew clearer. They were coming from inside the house. One night, she bolted upright in bed, certain she'd heard her name. The voice was soft, almost pleading. She turned on every light in the house and stayed awake until dawn, clutching a kitchen knife. Desperate for answers, Amanda called the landlord. When she mentioned the knocks and the strange noises, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I thought it had stopped, the landlord finally said, his voice shaky. What had stopped? Amanda demanded. The landlord hesitated, then admitted that previous tenants had complained about similar disturbances. But there was nothing in the house's history that could explain it. No tragedies, no record of anyone dying there. Feeling both angry and unnerved, Amanda decided to do her own research. She visited the local library and scoured old newspapers. That's when she found it. A black and white photograph from the 1920s, showing the house as it had looked nearly a century ago. Standing in the front yard was a family of 4, 2 parents and 2 children. But there, in the window of the second floor, was a shadowy figure. Its features were indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. That night, Amanda dreamed of the figure. In her dream, it stood at the foot of her bed, watching her. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and its presence radiated cold. She woke up gasping, her breath visible in the frigid air, though it was a warm summer night. She knew she couldn't stay in the house, but leaving wasn't so simple. The figure was no longer confined to her dreams or to the windows. She began seeing it out of the corner of her eye, lurking in doorways that reflected in mirrors, always watching. One night, the knocking turned into pounding. She barricaded herself in her bedroom, trembling as the door shook violently. The whispers escalated into screams, filling the house with a cacophony of anguish. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Amanda opened the door to find a single word scratched into the hallway wall. Leave. Amanda didn't need to be told twice. She packed a bag, jumped into her car, and drove until the house was nothing but a speck in her rearview mirror. She moved in with a friend and never returned to collect the rest of her things. Weeks later, she received a call from the landlord. The new tenants had left after only 3 days, claiming the house was haunted. He sounded desperate, begging Amanda for any advice. "Burn it down," she said, and hung up. Amanda never fully recovered from her experience. Even in her new apartment, she kept the blinds closed and avoided mirrors. She could never shake the feeling that the entity had followed her, waiting for the right moment to make itself known again. And sometimes late at night, she still hears it. Knock, knock. The cabin in the woods. It was the summer of 2017 when Sam and her friends decided they needed a break, a real escape from the stresses of everyday life. They wanted a weekend away from their jobs, their relationships, and the constant noise of the city. So when Sam found a small cabin listed on a remote property deep in the woods of upstate New York, they all jumped at the opportunity. The cabin was a bit rustic, situated on a quiet, secluded piece of land, the kind of place you could spend the weekend away from technology and the outside world. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace and quiet. Sam, along with her 2 closest friends, Jenna and Michael, were looking forward to the escape. They packed their bags, grabbed some food and drinks, and set off for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. The journey took longer than expected, the roads winding narrower and more overgrown as they got closer to their destination. By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was quaint, a small wooden structure surrounded by towering trees and a dense forest. It seemed almost untouched by time, like something straight out of an old horror movie. But Sam didn't let the eerie feeling get to her. Inside, the cabin was cozy. The living room was small but comfortable, with an old stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and a thick wool rug on the floor. There was no television, but there was a stack of books and board games in one corner, and Sam couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what they needed. They spent the evening playing cards, cooking dinner, and telling stories. After a few hours, they were laughing, feeling the weight of the world lift off their shoulders. But as the night deepened, a strange feeling settled over the cabin. Something about the stillness of the woods outside seemed unnerving. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was something unnatural about it. Around midnight, Sam excused herself and went to bed. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, one for Sam and Jenna, and one for Michael. As Sam lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she could hear strange creaks and groans from the old wooden structure. But she dismissed them as the house just being old. The first strange event happened the next morning. Sam woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was Jenna or Michael getting up early, but when she checked the time, it was just past 6 a.m., much earlier than any of them would typically rise. She listened carefully, but the footsteps stopped. Sam figured it was the wind or perhaps an animal outside. She went back to sleep, convincing herself it was nothing. Later that morning, when the 3 of them were sitting around the kitchen table having breakfast, Jenna brought up something unsettling. "Did either of you hear footsteps last night?" she asked, a nervous edge to her voice. "Like in the hallway?" Sam froze. "You heard it too?" Jenna nodded. "It sounded like someone was walking back and forth, but none of us were up." Michael shrugged, brushing it off with a half-hearted laugh. "Probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon outside the cabin." But Sam couldn't shake the feeling. The footsteps had been clear and deliberate. Not the casual scurrying of an animal, but the slow, measured steps of a person walking around the cabin. She tried to push the thought out of her mind and focus on the day ahead. The next few hours passed uneventfully. The friends spent the afternoon exploring the woods surrounding the cabin, enjoying the natural beauty of the place. They even stumbled upon an old, abandoned well hidden in the woods, a relic from another time, overgrown with vines and moss. It was unsettling, but they chalked it up to the rustic charm of the area. That evening, after dinner, the 3 friends sat around the fire pit outside the cabin, enjoying the cool night air. They were talking and laughing when Michael suddenly went quiet. "I thought I saw something in the window," he said, his voice shaky. "Just for a second." Sam looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Michael muttered. "It was like a figure, someone standing in the window, but when I looked again, nothing was there." Sam and Jenna exchanged glances. They had all been inside just moments before, and there was no one else on the property. It was just the three of them. "Probably just your mind playing tricks," Sam said, trying to lighten the mood. But deep down, she couldn't deny that a chill had run down her spine. That night, Sam lay in bed again, but this time, sleep was elusive. The strange feeling in the house had returned, an almost suffocating presence, as if something was watching her. The creaks and groans of the house seemed louder now, as if it was more alive than it should be. At 2 a.m., Sam was jolted awake by a sudden sound, a loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. This time, there was no mistaking it. The footsteps weren't from the wind or an animal. They were human, deliberate, and they sounded like they were moving toward her room. Sam's breath caught in her throat. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and for what felt like an eternity, there was complete silence. Then the door creaked open, just a crack. Sam's pulse quickened. Her body refused to move, her mind screaming at her to get up, but her body wouldn't obey. Finally, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. Sam leaped out of bed, her heart racing. She dashed to the door and flung it open, but the hallway was empty. Michael's door was still closed. Jenna's too. There was no sign of anyone being there. Shaking, Sam returned to her bed and pulled the covers tight around her, trying to convince herself it was a nightmare, that her mind had played tricks on her. But deep down, she knew what she had heard, what had happened. The next morning, Sam didn't mention anything to her friends. She couldn't. She didn't want to seem crazy. But Jenna was the one to bring it up first. "Did anyone feel weird last night?" Jenna asked, her voice shaky. "Like there was something in the cabin with us?" Michael nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I felt that too. I swear I heard someone whispering my name when I was lying in bed." That was enough to make Sam's stomach drop. She had felt it too. The presence, the unnatural coldness that seemed to settle in the cabin at night. Later that afternoon, Sam decided to go back to the well they had found the day before. She couldn't shake the feeling that somehow there was a connection. Something had happened here in the past and she needed to know more. When she arrived at the well, she was shocked to find something she hadn't noticed before. A weathered stone plaque, partially buried in the dirt near the well's edge. She brushed the dirt away, revealing a few words etched into the stone. "The soul of the restless remains." Sam's blood ran cold. She returned to the cabin, telling her friends everything she had found. As she spoke, Jenna went pale, and Michael looked like he was about to pass out. "I've been researching the cabin," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "This place has a dark history. It was built on land that was once used for something else. The previous owners, there were rumors they had been involved in something occult." Sam's mind raced. This wasn't just a spooky cabin in the woods, it was something far worse. That night, things went from strange to terrifying. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the house. "Get out!" It was a command, a warning. At 3 a.m., the temperature in the cabin plummeted. Sam and her friends huddled together in the living room, trying to figure out what to do. The door slammed open, and standing in the doorway was a figure. It was the one they had seen in the window. Its eyes were hollow, its face a blur of features twisted in anguish. The figure pointed at Sam and whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Panic overtook them. Sam, Jenna, and Michael ran for the door, but as they did, the house seemed to close in around them. The walls groaned, the floors creaked beneath their feet, and the figure's voice echoed in their minds. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, not daring to look back at the cabin. They never went back to the cabin. Sam didn't speak to Jenna or Michael much after that weekend. The memory of what they had experienced lingered with her, a constant weight on her chest. But every now and then, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, Sam can still hear the whisper in her mind, "You shouldn't have come." And she knows deep down that the cabin in the woods still waits for anyone who dares to seek it out. And that wraps up our journey into the strange and unexplained. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, these stories remind us that the world is full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this dive into the paranormal, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you experienced something you can't explain? We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious, because you never know what's lurking in the shadows. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next video.